See, all too often, we think, yeah, the cross is what we must go through. Christ's sacrificial death on the cross for our sin is what helps us, as we believe in Him, to reconnect with God because of our sin. And many of us have done that. But then we come to this world, and then we say, okay, God, I'm so thankful for the opportunity to spend eternity with you in heaven someday. But when it comes to this authority thing, I'll pick and choose, and I'll evaluate the what instead of the who. Because it's a spiritual decision now. We can't separate the two. We cannot separate the two. So, but wait a minute. What about, well, I read my Bible and I pray every day. Well, maybe not, but most days I try to. And I love God. I love God. I have a good relationship with God. Well, here's the shift in Paul's thinking in regards to this whole authority thing. It's not about the what, but it's about the who. Well, let's move on. Verses 2 through 3, he says this. So consequently, he who rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted. And those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from the fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right, and he will commend you. You get that? Here's the second principle. Here's the second principle. Your attitude in response. Your attitude in response to your human authorities is a direct reflection of your attitude in response to your heavenly Father. How you respond to authorities you can see is a direct reflection of how you're responding to the authority you can't see. What makes this even harder for some is if you have money. Because you know what money does? Money makes you feel powerful. Money makes you feel like you don't have to follow those rules. After all, isn't God blessing you with all that money? Isn't God seem to be blessing you with your resources that you have? See, this principle applies now to those business decisions that you're making at your workplace. Those opportunities to cheat in school. It's just not about the grade now. You see, that teacher is an authority over you. What about work? That handbook they have that tell us to do this and tell us to do that and tell us to do this and tell us to do that. Do you see how we evaluate the what? And we'll take some of those rules and we'll disregard that, and we'll take things from our work and not even feel guilty because we're justified, because they don't pay us enough money anyway. Wow. Paul now has made this a spiritual thing. He is communicating this truth when Nero, when Christians are going to the stake, when they're being persecuted, when most of us would rise up and say, oh, no way, couldn't be. So here's the truth. So rebelling against your human authorities is like rebelling against your Father in heaven. Wow. Well, let's go on, because if you are a person of authority. You're a boss, you're a teacher, you're a principal, vice principal, police officer. Paul goes on to say this about you. For this person of authority, he is God's servant to do you good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword for nothing. He is God's servant, an agent of wrath to bring judgment on the wrongdoer. Now, if you're an employee right here, you're probably thinking about your boss. Well, that's not talking about my boss. He's a jerk. My boss is a jerk. Doesn't matter if he's a jerk. Nero is the emperor at this time. Well, you can't be talking about my teacher. She's a lesbian or he's a homosexual. Doesn't matter. God works through human authority, period. Always has, and he always will. Good human authority, bad human authority. Righteous human authority, unrighteous human authority. Believing human authority, not believing human authority. Doesn't matter. The principle Paul is laying out is if you rebel against human authority, you are rebelling against your Father in heaven. I don't know about this or about you, but when I was going through this, it's like man, this gives me chills. Because this is scary for me. Because you know what? There's some things in my life that God brought to my attention. Paul goes on to talk about this human authority. He talks about, in the next verse, he goes on to say in verse 6, he gives an illustration. No, I'm sorry. Not yet. He says, therefore, it is necessary to submit to the authorities, not only because of possible punishment. You see, Paul knows what most of us avoid not aligning or going against or rebelling against authority. Paul knows why most of us don't do it. It's because of the punishment. You see, if most of us knew that we could get away with rebelling against that individual rule, we'd probably go for it. You see, if filling out that tax reform, if we knew we could get away with one more tax deduction, we'd do it. You see, if we knew we could get away with cheating on that test in school, we'd do it. You see, if we knew that we could get away with cheating on that rule that we told our spouse, till death do us part, we'd do it. Because after all, she or he's not loving me the way she or he should. And so I feel justified to take that rule and to disregard it. That's why Paul goes on in verse 6, or the rest of the verse says this. He says, therefore it is necessary to submit yourselves to the authorities, not because of possible punishment, but also because of conscience. It's just the right thing to do. And Paul is again connecting the whole idea is you cannot separate these two worlds. You cannot say, well, I can be okay. Outside of the authorities I can see and be okay with the authority I can't see. Can't do it. You can't do it. Paul goes on in verse 6 to say this. This is also then why he gives an illustration. Why you pay taxes. You see, earlier you might have thought, well, God's just talking about the spiritual leaders. He's not talking about spiritual leaders. He's talking about all leaders. Nero wants their taxes.